Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon session, post-lunch session. I'm Cynthia Barrow-Giles, chair of the first of two panels that will be treating the issue of Beyond Westminster, Imagining New Futures. And we have two distinguished panelists, Professors Patsy Lewis and Percy Hintzen. Professor Lewis has just nipped out for a minute, but she'll be back by the time I finish my introduction. So in the meantime, I'll just simply introduce Percy Hintzen. He's currently a professor in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies in the School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. And he also serves as an affiliate professor in African Studies, the African Studies program, and with the Latin American and Caribbean Center. He served for 32 years as a professor in the African American Studies Department at the University of California, Berkeley. He was also director of the Center for African Studies and co-director of the multi-campus research group on Africa that serves all of the 10 campuses of the University of California, where he served until December 2011 when he left for FIU. He has also served in a number of administrative positions at Berkeley, including chair of African American Studies, which he held for 8 years. He was director of Peace and Conflict Studies and acting director of the Center for Race and Gender. He joined Berkeley as an assistant professor in 1979, and he has also served as international president of the Caribbean Studies Association. His scholarship is organized around an examination of the relationship between African diaspora and the modern condition. More generally, his work examines relationships among modernity, political economy, and the production of difference. His research has primarily focused on the West Indies, Africa, and the black immigrants to the United States. He has published extensively and of course has numerous articles in journals and chapters in books on race, ethnicity, class, and political economy. And today he will speak on the issue of towards a new politics of glocalization in the Caribbean, local empowerment, regional reformulation, and the new global order. We have, and she will be presenting first, Professor Patsy Lewis, who is currently a professor at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies at the Mona campus, UWI. She coordinates research clusters at SALISES on regional integration and Grenada. She's a graduate of both the University of the West Indies Mona campus and the Cambridge University. She completed a BA degree in mass communications, and that's when I met her after she finished that degree at the Consortium Graduate School initially. She received her first class honors there, and she also has a diploma in public administration from UWI, and an MPhil in International Relations and a PhD in History at Trinity College, Cambridge. She received a Rockefeller postdoctoral fellowship in the humanities to the Center of African and Afro-American Studies, University of Michigan. Professor Lewis's work has focused broadly on the political and economic challenges that small states experience in achieving independent survival. And I think her first book is on the OACS in the global environment. Specifically, she has sought to analyze the legitimacy of the United States invasion of Grenada and the region's role in this. She has also focused on regional integration, on the regional integration experience, its possibilities and failings in addressing many of the challenges that are common to the Caribbean. This has led to the publication of a book, Surviving Small Size, Regional Integration in Caribbean Mini-States, and at least 7 journal articles and book chapters, and there is much more. She is taking the lead on the Caribbean integration project, a cluster on development in the Caribbean. She's anxious to come because she wants more than her 20 minutes. She shall receive 20 minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, we know our chair can steal minutes. She has already set the precedent. Okay, my biography is only 2 or 3 sentences long. So you have to thank Christine Crew for her creativity in putting together this long description of me that, you know. I am assured after lunch on the second day that the people in the room are people who are really, really interested in what we have to say. And they're not here because we're prime ministers, and they're hoping, you know, to, I don't quite know what. Okay, I'm looking at Beyond Westminster in the Caribbean, a perspective on the regional project. And most of the writings on Westminster have focused on national politics. Few make mention of the region, and those who do view the region as a solution for the problems of Westminster as they appear at the national level. The question of how Westminster inhibits the regional project is not well explored, although I have attempted to raise this concern in work I've done. The further task of what a new regional democratic process should look like and how the regional project can be transcended to achieve this remains, how the national project can be transcended to achieve this remains unexplored, although some have made tentative suggestions. Now, what I would like to do today is establish a relationship between certain features of Westminster as practiced in the Caribbean, namely the first past the post, and the predominant role of the Prime Minister, and the effects of these on the regional integration project. I would also like to, start a discussion on ways in which these features of the national politics can be overcome. Paul Sutton, in his discussion of Westminster in the Caribbean and the failed attempts at constitutional reform, predicts that reform is likely to occur in the context of a region-wide crisis which forces the countries to consider a regional project, a federation along the lines of the U.S. model. Tennyson Joseph also suggests that the resolution of deficiencies in national constitutions will occur at the regional level in a federation. And you can see his quotation and why he thinks this is so. This tendency to view federation as the best option for resolving some of the weaknesses inherent in the national sphere is not new. In the wake of the collapse of the West Indies Federation, and before the formalization of post-independence constitutions for Barbados and the Windward and Leeward Islands, Arthur Lewis made a case for a federal structure largely on the ground of good government. And you see his quote here. Now we'll say governance. The location of the salvation of the democratic defects in national constitutions in the regional project ignores the dynamic interface between national politics and the impact on the regional integration project. I have laid the prime responsibility for CARICOM's implementation deficit, which has been well recognized in the literature, at the feet of the character of national politics. Specifically, I wish to identify two of the features, as I said in the introduction, of the Westminster system that contribute to this: the first past the post, or winner takes all, and the excessive authority of the PM. In discussing the first past the post, this feature of Westminster constitutions have been well recognized. It amplifies the victories of parties which may have small majorities or even minorities by allowing them a large share of parliamentary seats, thus marginalizing opposition parties. It further makes it very difficult terrain for third parties to function. Sebin Ryan has explored this relationship extensively, but his analysis does not extend in winner takes all. He hasn't extended to the regional process. But I have taken off from where he's left off and his insights, as well as some of my own, to look at how this operates in the region. So my argument is that this feature is carried over, the oppositionist role of politicians at the national level is carried over at the regional level, where the opposition does not have a formal role and where in its absence the heads of government operate as a club. A feature of the governance model of CARICOM decision-making is that this occurs at a regional rather than a national level. Heads of governments arrive at decisions at their meetings, then expect these to be implemented at the national level. Decisions are not driven by debates and consensus at the national level, which would then inform action at the regional. The natural outcome of this is the politicization of regional issues, which then fall prey to national politics once they enter the national sphere. And this is particularly crucial in cases where implementation requires the input of the opposition. Although in cases requiring simple majorities, this also presents a problem. This is a quotation from an article I did, which develops the point. One element of the continued marginalization of opposition parties in the regional project is the effect on the continuity of decisions over time. Unfortunately for regional decision-making, politics in the region are fluid, with a healthy change of administrations after national elections. Barrow-Giles has observed this. Again, you can look at this quotation. The result of this fluidity is that today's head of government is tomorrow's opposition leader who finds himself on losing power with no mechanism for contributing to decision-making at the regional level. And CCJ is an example of this, where both Basilio Pandey in Trinidad and Edward Seaga in Jamaica supported the formation of the CCJ until they were out, when they were in power, but at the point of implementation, when they were out of power, they resisted it vigorously. So at the regional level, therefore, the opposition finds, because of its exclusion from regional decision-making, that it has no option but to adopt an oppositionist stance. For to support the government at the regional level would be to weaken its role as opposition at the national level, where its primary concern is to gain power. Thus, national politics takes precedence over regional concerns. And I will discuss this absence of the opposition a little later. But I argue that its absence from the regional decision-making process is one of the key impediments to regional implementation and the slow movement of the integration process. Now we turn to look at the excessive authority of the Prime Minister. And Sutton summarizes this as excessive authority and overwhelming power constitutionally granted to the Prime Minister, and the further concentration of power due to the ineffective separation between the executive and legislature. Terry and Gilbert Roberts, seated at the back of the room, has located this feature of Caribbean politics at the heart of the implementation deficit characterizing CARICOM. She argues that in the Caribbean, sovereignty has become embedded in the person of the leader and not the people, and is magnified at the regional level in the absence of a regional identity, which she defines as, quote, ideas supported by measurable collective action, unquote. While this is an important insight into the role of the Prime Minister and how this carries over with negative consequences to the regional project, I would suggest that the relationship is a bit more complex, in that despite the dominance of prime ministers at home and within the CARICOM decision-making structures, their role at the regional level is somewhat paradoxical. In the decision-making structure of CARICOM, heads of governments, prime ministers oftentimes act as lone agents, making decisions on behalf of their countries, oftentimes without the support even of members of their own government and party, far less the opposition. In such a scenario, then, regional decisions are a hard sell, so implementation suffers. While governments can rule on the basis of parliamentary majority at the national level, they are moribund at the regional level, where changes require national input. So I would argue that it is clear that any progress towards a new form of regional government, federation or otherwise, is contingent on national constitutional change, or a regional structure that is able to overcome the effect of national partisan politics. Now, constitutional reform and the summary, I've borrowed this quote from Sutton, who has summarized the main issues he sees coming out of constitutional reforms. But I would like to suggest that from the regional perspective, the aspects of the discussions that concern us more are addressing the marginalization of the opposition, including third parties inherent in the winner-takes-all feature of the constitutions, the replacement of the Queen as head of state, and the replacement with a more appropriate model, the entrenchment of the CCJ as a final court of appeal, a stronger alignment between national constitutions and regional goals so that regional decisions are given legal effect in national constitutions to address one of the challenges of implementation confronting CARICOM. Now, I stand to be corrected by, I was already corrected in Prime Minister Gonzalez's speech last night, and I stand to be further corrected by Hamid, Selwyn, and Cynthia if I'm wrong. But I would argue that the approaches to constitutional reform, despite the regional problem and the common features across the region in national constitutions, have been treated as being purely an internal matter. And that CARICOM, despite its commitment to harmonizing laws and its role in drafting model laws to facilitate legislative commonality in the region, has had no formal input in these efforts to reform post-independence constitution. CARICOM's disengagement is underscored by the absence in these debates of reform in the direction of facilitating regional decision-making. Yet, given the similarity of challenges with Westminster and the effect on national constitutions in stymieing CARICOM implementation, shouldn't there be a regional project to address these weaknesses? Couldn't the region become an avenue for breaking down national partisanship? Despite a legitimate case for the engagement of the CARICOM Secretariat in this process of constitutional reform, it would be naive to believe that this would be a smooth process, given the current features of regional governance that already exist or have already raised. It is quite likely that the process could follow past patterns of heads of government agreeing on an approach and in the process alienating the opposition parties with the expected results. You can argue that CARICOM Secretariat could drive it, then it would be a purely bureaucratic process, but I argue that given the dominance of CARICOM and by heads of governments and the ruling parties, governments, it is most unlikely that this would not become politicized. And another approach would be to transform the regional decision-making process to take account of these weaknesses. And that would be in the direction of expanding opportunities for shaping regional decision-making. Now, basically, in looking at attempts, the issue of democratizing CARICOM, I've looked at the institutions, I think, that offer the potential for doing so, which is the Assembly of Caribbean Parliamentarians, the ACCP, and the Civil Society Forum. Obviously, don't have the time to go into this. I see a 5-minute thing there. I don't know if I'm supposed to glance across at it. Not yet? Okay, good. Okay, but to cut a long story short, both of these institutions, and I'm using institutions loosely, were developed in the mid to late 90s. And basically, they were supposed to have been a means through which people can exert some degree of representation at the regional level. Neither institution allows for voting. They're basically consultative mechanisms. In terms of the ACCP, its membership is supposed to be on elections from within the parliament. So immediately we see that this is would be dominated by the ruling party. Further, it would exclude third parties who are not in parliament. So we're talking about not a system that really fully engages the opposition party. Furthermore, it depends on government for funding. So even if government, this is supposing that government has an interest in funding the participation of the opposition. And that even if they did, they had the wherewithal to do so. Obviously, because of this loose structure, it has not been a very successful mechanism, meeting only 3 times so far. Civil society is a similar story, not really firmly entrenched, relying on governments to facilitate the engagement of civil society. Understandably, that hasn't gone very far. There was a process in 2010, which was funded by the EU, to mobilize civil society, with CARICOM executing it, to try to find models for engagement between civil society and CARICOM. This is not driven by CARICOM's own desire to engage civil society, but is based on the EU's commitment that within the ACP, Africa, Caribbean, Pacific agreement, and the Cotonou arrangement, and the EPA, that a commitment to engage with civil society, and also comes out of the EU's interest in promoting CARICOM integration. So we see the problem again, that funding of such an important element is subject to external, it's an externally driven process. So I would argue that just to point another criticism in respect of the civil society grouping provision, that Christina Hines Harrison, in her critique, speaks of the problem with conceptual clarity or the absence thereof in how the region speaks to civil society. Stakeholders, social partners, and I'm not quite sure what they mean, who they mean to engage, and on what terms. I would like to argue further that the focus on civil society, which is used to refer to formally organized sections of society, stand to marginalize sections of the society that are not organized in formal organizations. And I posit that this is a majority of the people in our societies. Now, what is the way forward? Drawing from this discussion, it is clear that the structures that currently exist do not provide an adequate vehicle for popular engagement. I have already... Okay, the ACCP would have to be entrenched, adequately funded, and revised to provide a greater role for opposition parties both within and outside of Parliament. It must go beyond advising and consulting to directly influencing decision-making, which means reviewing decisions of heads of government and putting issues on a regional agenda. I argue, though, that whatever attempts at democratizing the regional process cannot take place without similar mechanisms at the national level. So I see both processes as intertwined, because the kind of artificial divide that is envisaged and is stipulated in the ACCP agreement for national issues to be kept off the agenda of the ACCP is really, in effect, trying to make an artificial divide, because CARICOM is a regional project that ultimately is supposed to advance national issues and concerns. I argue further that it is not sufficient to rely on deepening the engagement of opposition parties or even of civil society as a basis for fully democratizing CARICOM. What I argue for is a more direct role for popular democracy. I just want to quote Terrian again, Gilbert Roberts. As she says, this process requires a transformation of the meaning and role of sovereignty in Caribbean politics towards a popular conceptualization of sovereignty, which invests sovereignty in the region's people rather than its political leaders. My own view is that small societies provide opportunities for the exercise of direct democracy which have not been explored. Tennyson, Joseph, points to the potentially positive role of technology in the democratic process, although we need to be mindful of the possible ways in which technology can alienate sections of the society, the old and poor. I wish to end where I began, with suggestions by both Joseph and Sutton, echoing Lewis in an earlier period, that federation might be the means for addressing change to Westminster constitutions. Arthur Lewis suggested that the federal government had been handicapped by the absence of organized party support, since the so-called West Indian Federal Labour Party was just a collection of diverse local groups. I would wish to argue that the formation of a regional party in and of itself is not a sufficient condition for addressing partisan politics, but may in all likelihood lead to a shift of domestic partisan forms to the regional level. Further, it holds the danger of further marginalization of citizens from the centers of power when politicians are further removed from popular reach. Joseph, even as he questioned why a Caribbean Integration Party has never been formed, rejected the party as a vehicle for the expression of regional aspirations on the ground that it had been transformed in the post-colonial period from an instrument of liberation to one of oppression, arguing that it should be smashed and put aside forever. In its place, he recommends a shift to grassroots forms of organization with a pan-Caribbean agenda and a pan-Caribbean structure. I'm almost finished, Cynthia. The dangers of the preeminent role of the Prime Minister in small countries are well known. Arthur Lewis, as you saw in the slide before, made a clear case for this. What is less explored are the potentially positive outcomes for democracy of the closeness of the Prime Minister and other political figures to their nationals. Throughout the Caribbean, and in particular the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, Prime Ministers do not operate as distant figures but are easily accessible. Moreover, they are expected to take a personal role in people's lives. And I argue that this goes beyond the patronage clientelist dynamic that Carl Stone identified as typifying the Jamaican political climate, although there's an element of this, and it must be guarded against in small states. Rather, it is the perspective that views the Prime Minister as having an intimate role in improving citizens' lives. This is an environment that makes the implementation of structural adjustment policies difficult, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on your perspective. This aspect of Eastern Caribbean political life requires further exploration by social scientists to identify not only its weaknesses, but its potential for enhancing democracy. Under what conditions, for example, could popular expectations of the role of the Prime Minister act as a check against the Prime Minister functioning as a leader of the party and his supporters and of the country? Establishing whether this is a desirable feature of national politics in small states is important in shaping our vision of what regional governance should resemble. Whether at the local or regional level, how people conduct politics is important. Unlike Sutton and Joseph's identification of the federal form as a model for addressing the constitutional changes required in the region, I would hesitate to prescribe any particular model. I caution against this in my study of the OECS Political Union Initiative, and I conclude with a quotation drawn from the conclusion of that book, in which I argue that we should try to look at the emergence of a political form that is new and uniquely developed to suit the specific requirements of the region and build to respond to challenges as they emerge. Thank you.
When I was writing this paper, I was reading a volume that is about to come out by Professor Brian Meeks called Critical Interventions in Caribbean Politics and Theory. And I think that it's going to be a very, very important and significant, I don't think it's out now yet, it's going to be a very, very important and significant way of thinking about politics and political economy in the Caribbean for a number of reasons. One of the things I think that becomes important here is that whatever we say about whatever political model is always contingent upon the constraints placed upon that model. If we are to think about whether or not that model would achieve the desired ends. So it may be quite useful when thinking about the Westminster form of government to reflect on the concerns that provoked its interrogation in this conference and to acknowledge that these concerns are quite universal and not confined to political economies where some version of the Westminster model is practiced. This may provoke a reconsideration of our focus in an attempt to get to the crux of the crisis that has directed our concerns. Is there a clicker here?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Patsy. Yeah. I hope you're taking off the minutes there. Okay. I am not sure that adoption of the formalities of Westminster-style democratic governance, which we have all been talking about, guarantees any particular desirable outcome. There is, as with most things, no necessary coincidence between form and practice. So the focus should be on practice, irrespective of the form, irrespective of our discussions of constitutional changes. You know, these things are practiced. You know, we could say whatever we want about Constitution. It is the way they are practiced. Because it seems that for most of the former British colonies, notwithstanding their impressive scores on various democracy indices and ranking, to which they point with pride, their populations have not escaped the maladies of a universal global crisis which imposes itself upon practice. And this crisis has intensified with the shift in emphasis from national development models and I think what Dr. Joseph calls social democratic models, to neoliberal models that have induced the current forms of globalization. Democratic governance is a means. It is an instrumentality to the achievement of valued ends. So we need to focus on what these ends are purported to be, whether these ends are actually desired, and we need to focus on the role of whatever form of government is practiced, and particularly, since we are concerned with the Westminster model, on deviations from it, and whether or not these produce the things, the goals that we want. One thread of such inquiry has to be a focus on the manner in which governance is exercised and practiced in the West Indies, however it is defined. So we could talk about the form as much as we want, but form and practice deviate from each other. We need to begin our analysis normatively, in the form of a declaration about the instrumental role of democratic governance. It is only then that we can assess its practice, however closely this practice adheres or does not adhere to its British provenance. We may very well find that whatever its form, its practice in the former English colonies of the Caribbean does not diverge much, and its outcomes in varying degrees and under different registers have not been coincident with its purported end. And everywhere, this is more or less the case. And we have to also argue that whatever is practiced, it is not necessarily consistent with the universal narrative of democracy as an ideal. Now, what I'm going to do is to use some very, very standard economists. You know, because the Nobel laureates, you know, particularly those who adhere to the Keynesian economic model, like Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, and of course Amartya Sen, are now criticizing the very economics that we think is going to resolve our problem. And economics itself is moving to behavioral economics, primarily because they have found that the sort of neoliberal form and the focus on econometrics have not produced what it's purported to produce. And I think we forget that economics and governance, you know, is based on the production of certain valued goods. And this is what Nobel economist Amartya Sen has advanced. He has advanced a useful proposition about democratic practice, and I'm going to start reading here because I'm going to run out of time, as an ideal. In the final analysis, it is an institutional arrangement, and it should be rooted in the exercise of people's freedoms through the liberty to participate in social choice and in making public decisions. And whether we have the fancy structures and forms, if it does not do that, if people are not free to participate in social choice and in making public decisions, we could have any model we want and it's not going to work. The goals of these must ideally be the achievement and expansion of economic opportunities, political liberties, social powers, the enabling conditions of good health, basic education, and the encouragement and cultivation of initiatives. And this is what we have to measure democratic practice against. This is what we have to measure it against, irrespective of tinkering with its constitutionalities. If it does not produce that, then there's something wrong with the practice of governance. There has to be something wrong with the practice of governance. Otherwise, we just engaged in nonsensical discussions. Democratic practice must be measured against its instrument effects of enhancing and guaranteeing the substantive freedoms of individuals, seen as active agents of change rather than as passive recipients of dispensed benefits, which is You know, I mean, people, you have the experts, the rule of experts, and they say, this is what we want you to do, this is what you're going to have, and if you don't have it, it's your fault. When and where this has been the case in the West Indies has occurred outside of and in opposition to the official formal practice of quote-unquote democratic governance. People create the conditions for their own betterment outside of the practice of democratic governance. This has to do with the limitations built into the Westminster model and its modifications and deviations, the limitations to effective participation in governance, to all but the middle and upper strata of West Indian society. And this has left the lower strata, or what we might say, the subaltern, as the overwhelming majority, to create its own conditions for economic opportunity, its own conditions for political freedoms, its own conditions for social facilities, transparency guarantees, and protective security. People are left outside the framework of formal governance to do these things for themselves. And this has been historically true. People have created the conditions for their own development and for the development of the society outside of, despite and independent of the constraints of the states. For the middle and upper strata, the terms and conditions and content of these guarantees are integrally tied to powerful international interests and the constraints, limitations, and impediments imposed by these interests. And this is the excuse they use. They say, well, you know, it's the IMF. You know, it's the World Bank, it's America. You know, that is why we can't, we have this debt to GDP ratio. That's what they say, it's the IMF. The role of post-colonial governance is to guarantee political and civil liberties and the absolute freedom to participate in social, political, and economic life of the community. That's the role of governance. It is also, in other words, the effect of governance should be the expansion of economic opportunity, the expansion of political liberties, the expansion of social powers, and the enabling conditions of good health, basic education, and the encouragement and cultivation of initiatives. The role of post-colonial democracy by these sets of standards, if true development is to be achieved, must be the expansion of individual capabilities to allow every individual the exercise of freedom in order to impel the progress of these opportunities. And the problem is with development and representative democracy. The practice of representative democracy and its developmentalist justification in the West Indies has rendered invisible, I think I could make it, 9 minutes, has rendered invisible the unequal access to social, economic, and political opportunities, because what it does, it uses it as a narrative. It says, you know, you have free elections, you have democratic practices, you know, you could vote and so on and so on and so on, so therefore, you know, you're okay. It is a myth. It discounts the differentiation among individuals and groups. It doesn't respond to difference, except in the distinctions it makes between those whose progress should be managed by virtue of being poor. And it also says that the elite happen to be agents of development. The elite, like all of us in here, who have degrees, we become the experts. It refuses to take into account in policy formulation the varieties and diversity of physical, economic, and social environments and the different demands that ensue, from such variety. And this was the criticism of Soviet Marxism. But we said, okay, Soviet Marxism, you know, has a problem, and the economists said it, but when this same system of sort of universal understanding and top-down governance without taking into consideration diversity, when it is applied to liberal democracy, you know, no one says that it's a problem. The task of enhancement of the capabilities of the populace falls upon the initiative and ingenuity of disparate individuals and groups engaged in survival strategies and pursuing their profound interest in their own security and well-being, in the security and well-being of their families, and in the security and well-being of the communities. In other words, development is occurring in spite of, against, and in contestation with the practice of liberal democracy in the Caribbean. So what we have to say is the development has a subaltern foundation. Subaltern meaning those persons who are excluded from the practice of government. The stage for post-colonial development, understood as the expansion of political and economic capabilities, was forged in contestation to governing practices by those, it was forged by those who were excluded as effective participants in government. The very conditions of post-colonial representative democratic practice were established in response to working class power. We know that. We know that. Educated and professional members of the colonized populations then assumed positions as political leaders in these working in these trade union and popular movements. But these things existed before. They existed before. So those excluded from effective governance are not obstacles to progress. They're not obstacles to development. Rather, they are the creators of the possibilities for the realization of progress. Given the system of representative governments that Westminster model exemplifies and the interest that it supports, those with the most important physical and economic knowledge of their environments are denied access to representative government through elite claims to expert knowledge. And I'm speaking particularly of the economists. These subaltern subjects are best suited for true democratic practice. They have the power, they do have power, even though this power is rendered invisible by discourses of governance. True development occurs outside, in contestation with, and as a rejection of the governing apparatus of the state. And when the governing elite employs global and international alliances and networks to escape the strictures and limitations of neocolonial and imperialism, they also create the possibilities for true development. But the elite, they have to employ, they have to use the strategies to escape those strictures. Otherwise, persons are left. Now, there are new possibilities for a new organization of governance. And these new possibilities are emerging in terms of changes in the structure of global relations, new changes in the structure of global relations. And these offer up opportunities for a reconstitution of forms of governance that may accommodate the different and diverse strategies of non-state actors. And these strategies are aimed at forms of development that involve the enhancement of the capabilities. Important in this regard for the Caribbean are the growing possibilities and actualities for the use of South-South tricontinental ties to free systems of governance from the legacies of colonial commandment instantiated in liberal forms of representative government that is exemplified by the Westminster model. Now, what we're talking about are megatrends in the global architecture of power. And basically, I'm not going to go through this. The megatrends are that the basis of global power, the basis of national governance, the basis of social organization, and those who are directing it is shifting from the North Atlantic to the global South. And I'm not going to go through those, but hopefully you have to read it. Now, scholars from the global South, like Vandana Shiva, are now talking about what a new democracy should speak about. Creating governance systems that give a vote to those who will bear the costs when decisions are being made. A question of subsidiarity, the shifting of economic and political power downward. Sovereignty, the principle that those who are most affected by decisions of governance should be the paramount decision makers. Ecological sustainability, guarantees of basic needs for all people as a right, and guarantees of health, education, public safety, and security. A guaranteed standard of living adequate for health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, the right to security, and the right to employment. Guarantees of political and civil rights, which seems to be the only guarantees that people are talking about in the Westminster model. The right to jobs, livelihood, and employment. Guarantees of food security and safety. ensuring that all international agreements support the goal of creating sustainable societies. And these things our governments have agreed to. They have signed the international the declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. They have committed themselves to this. They have committed themselves to it. So in other words, they're violating the very terms upon which they say. Now, there are new possibilities for forms. One of the things, I have three. Effective participation of the diaspora in government. Caribbean migrants living abroad need to be integrated in a new structure of governance as effective participants. This needs to be fundamentally different from current forms of what I call governmentalized practice, where governments attempt to exercise control over overseas diasporas for co-optation in support of developmentalist and neo-colonial agendas and to prevent destabilizing challenges to state apparatus. You know, subsidiarity, what I call subsidiarity, and this is based on a Gandhian principle, but you know, we have it a number of places. The reinvigoration of conditions by which local communities have the power to determine and control their preferred economic and political paths. Increasing democratic control of the economy by communities or nation states, taking it back from global institutions that have appropriated it. The institution of government practices to allow nations, local governments, and communities to reclaim their economies, making them as diverse as possible and allowing them to rebuild stability into community life. The reintroduction of safeguards that were traditionally used to protect domestic and local economies. And finally, the enacting of legal empowerment. Legal empowerment is the process whereby the poor and excluded become able to use the law, the legal system and legal services to protect and advance their rights and interests as a citizen. It is pivotal and essential for, this is pivotal and essential for the access of the subaltern to governance as a basis of improving their lives and livelihoods and for the enhancement of their capacities, including health, education, entitlements, social inclusion in the legal structure, the means for peaceful dispute of conflict resolution, and environmental sustainability, which is very, very problematic. It demands a fundamental reformulation of the legal system and effective participation in it by everyone, including equal access and equal justice, free from exclusionary and punitive disciplinary practices. Now, what I'm saying is people may, you know, when you say this, people say, it can't happen. It can't happen. What I'm saying is that we have to think. You know, the Europeans didn't say colonialism couldn't happen. You know, they figured it out. They figured it out. It was something that they didn't say it. And I think that what we have to say is, okay, we understand the constraints on governance today, but we also have to look at the new possibilities, because there are new systems in the new systems of organization, and these things are being dictated not by the colonizing powers, but by places like India, by Brazil, China, Mexico, Turkey, everywhere as they're being, and this offers us opportunities to begin to think, what are we going to do with those opportunities, as opposed to saying we're forever stuck, we speak English, so we can't, the Chinese don't speak English, which they do, you know, so you know, we have to begin to think about the possibility. So when the opportunities open, in the same way that the subaltern populations, they have to work out their livelihood free from the constraints. They don't say, well, we have to die. They don't say, well, we have to die because this is what the system is. They work it out in very many different ways. And I think we have to begin to think of doing that. I have a negative 2 minutes. Negative 2 minutes. Good mathematician. Negative say I've overstayed my time. Thank you.
Just to say thank you to the two presenters. I'll say no more because we have to end promptly at 2:15 because the panel begins promptly at 2:15. So I'll ask those who are now queuing to stay on point and to make it as brief as possible so we can have discussion for at least 10, 12 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Gerald Williams is the name. This is for the first presenter. I am somewhat confused. Are you on which side? Is it that you're suggesting that Westminster model is for or against democracy? And the second part is geared to democracy. I don't know if I'm reading it correctly, Patsy, but I'm getting the sense that you think that direct democracy is uniformly better than representational democracy. There are some issues that are better handled by direct democracy. Big moral issues, should there be gay marriage, should there be capital punishment. But there are other issues which direct democracy don't deal very well with. I should better say, the average person will spend more intellectual energy on a game of bridge than in trying to address a political economy problem. And the last thing I want to leave, the last question, an issue like the Caribbean Court of Justice has no business in a referendum. That's a technical issue that has to be worked through. And if you put it to a referendum, you're probably going to get lawyers and a couple of politicians participating and nobody else. I'd like to leave with the question. You talk about rights. Does the right of one person extend to the pocket of another?
Oh, that's for me, Peter. Oh, right.
Yes, greetings. Yes, after listening to all the presentations, the thing coming to me is that all of the governments throughout the Caribbean are operating with people who are elected because of popularity or wealth. None come to the board with any criteria, any job description. Should it be a time now when we look at creating job descriptions for the particular office?
Okay, I'll try. Am I saying, I wasn't quite sure if I understood the first question. Am I saying that Westminster doesn't allow for democracy? Oh, I don't know what's happening with my end. Am I saying that Westminster doesn't allow for democracy? I am saying that it's not enough. I'm saying, but I don't want to repeat my paper, but basically I'm saying that there are certain features of it that do not allow for a democratic decision-making process in CARICOM because it emphasizes the role of governments, heads of states, and then you run into a problem when they are no longer in power and you have a new set of people and they no longer have a vested interest and you have conflicts there. I'm saying that we need to find ways to democratize the process, but I'm arguing that it is a dynamic process. It's very difficult to achieve one without the other. It's very difficult to achieve democratization of CARICOM without looking at ways in which we can also democratize the national sphere to allow for national decision making to then influence regional projects. So I suggest it's a more complex dynamic. I don't know if that answers your question. Direct democracy. I'm not suggesting, yes, I have a problem with representational democracy. Because I like to have the option to express my views. I may not avail myself of the opportunity most of the time, but I may well want to reserve the right so to do. And I think we have to separate people's right to exercise their voice and their vote and whatever from whether they actually avail themselves of that right and prefer to play dominoes. I mean, that's a choice, but the point is you give them a choice. I think we may have to have, I'm not suggesting that every decision has to be put to the popular vote, and there will have to be negotiation on what we think should be within the purview, but obviously I would be going more in direction of a more extensive agenda than the narrow focus we have now. I would disagree profoundly with the example. Gay marriage is the one thing you do not put to a popular vote. And I disagree with the Prime Minister last night That is not the role for civil society. You can't rely on the majority to protect the right of the minority. That is why we have politicians. And that is one area where your argument of having something that arbitrates and structure and that is not just the popular element has merit on that particular question. That's how I'll answer that. Who decides what is legitimate in anybody's pocket? I think a lot of it has to do with the system that allows money to go to your pocket. One day it might be slavery that allows money to go into your pocket. Then that becomes immoral. And then you have a different economic system that might seem moral for a while. In another age it may not be. So I think that it's a more complex question than it appears.
Now let me say something about rights. You know, people are talking about rights. Almost all countries are signatories to conventions. The convention, the UN Convention on Human Rights, and a phenomenal amount of conventions. You know, all countries are signatories to that. The problem is that they choose to focus on, at least liberal democracy, chooses to focus on political and civil rights, and they forget that there's economic rights, social rights, cultural rights, etc., etc. And this was the problem that John Maynard Keynes had with the new global system that he designed. You know, this is the problem that he had with the development of the new global system, the World Bank, the IMF, and GATT. You know, he says that when the powers that be took his ideas, what they did, they decided that they're not going to put the rights of the population through the rights of labor into GATT. This is what he said. But all countries are signatories to it. So there's a particular type of universal consensus as to what those rights are. And the rights that I mentioned in my paper are very much, they're all part of that universal consensus. So if governments cannot provide those rights, then there's something wrong with governance. There has to be something wrong with governance if they agree to something and they're not providing it. And if anyone says that people have a right to work, a right to health care, all these other rights, if they think that in the Caribbean we have those rights, we don't. And therefore government has to be impeached, I think.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll move to the next one.
Just a quick question to Patsy. I quite enjoyed your emphasis on the issue of regional integration. It was always a concern to me, and I think I said that to the Sanusha Commission, that they were doing a constitutional review of when they were actually in a process of deepening OECS integration. So I wasn't sure whether it makes sense to be reviewing the Sanusha Constitution, when at the same time you were doing a new economic space for the OECS and you were talking about a future political union of the OECS. Perhaps the place that they should have started by starting with a new constitution for a unified Caribbean state. So my question to you is, to go back to yesterday, Jessica asked the question about the RCAs that took place in the early 1990s. Could the answer be that we forget, and not to sound too extreme, forget the national CRCs and start a process of demanding that CARICOM, because as part of this discussions on integration, begin regional constituent assemblies again, but even put on the agenda possible constitution, and that's where the discussion has to go. Let me talk about the future state, let people see what the Civil Disinvention Constitution order will give you, what the new thing would look like. Let the Caribbean people see what the new regional state would look like, and then let them debate it and so forth. So are we just wasting our energies doing the local CRCs, or should we be moving towards a more regional type of constituent assembly to resolve the problem?
Okay, I think there are two issues here. One is whether, and I will separate them, one is whether constitutional change should be addressed as a regional problem. Whether we look at the common features, as I suggested, that need to be changed across the region, and whether we produce model laws or model approaches. Of course, we have variations to deal with national things, peculiarities, so that we all agree that first past the post is going to be formed in this way. We all agree we're going to get rid of the head of government. Now you are taking it a step further by saying where you're going is saying, forget this. Let's look at one constitution for a politically united region. Now that's a political thing, as you know, Tennyson. That's not technical. CARICOM Secretariat can't do that. It has to get direction from the heads of government. So it's a moot point. It really is a moot point. It's more obvious it's more feasible in the context of the OECS, because I think the OECS is further along the line, imaginatively, of a political process. And it's really, I think, particularly in the context of the OECS, where there has been some devolution of decision-making to the authority in certain spheres, that process can be deepened, and that maybe there definitely is an argument for saying that there is enough in the OECS that we agree on to advance constitutional development at that level, rather than the local level where you have the St. Vincent experience. But I don't think that you're going to have that in the broader CARICOM, because I really don't think Jamaica in particular is on board with that. I don't even think Jamaican politicians know or care what's happening in constitutional reform necessarily. Maybe I'm just, not being generous. But I think that the OECS can be a good place to start.
Okay, I want to thank you for your attendance and participation in this panel. I'm going to ask Dr. Christine Cummings to convene her panel immediately. And thank you.